Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal, absurd and very real world of medieval duels, where the phrase settling things like men meant risking death over a chicken, a spilled drink, or a badly aimed insult. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, someone in your village accuses you of stealing their cow. Or maybe they say you insulted their honor, or worse, questioned their lineage. In medieval Europe, there were a few ways to handle this. Option 1, talk it out like reasonable adults. That never happens. Option 2, challenge them to a duel. Now we're talking. This is trial by combat, the preferred legal method of settling disputes when paperwork was scarce and tempers were not. The concept was noble in theory. Let two parties fight it out, and the winner is obviously telling the truth, because God would never let a liar win a sword fight. Spoiler, God stayed out of most of these. The rules, if we can call them that, were hazy at best. In some places, you were supposed to use the same weapon, swords, axes or clubs, depending on the social class and how fancy the occasion was. In others, it was less about standardization and more about enthusiasm. You could show up in a full suit of armor while your opponent had nothing but a boiled leather vest and optimism. The setting? Not quite the cinematic duel atop a misty cliff. It was usually a muddy field, a town square, or whatever patch of land was flat enough for swinging things. Occasionally spectators gathered, not for fairness and just for entertainment. And these fights were not elegant. Forget graceful fencing or Shakespearean monologues. Medieval duels were awkward, sweaty, and exhausting. Two people clanking around in heavy gear, wheezing through metal grills, hoping the other one slipped in the mud first. Interestingly, you didn't always have to kill the other person. If they surrendered, maybe with a loud "uncle" or just by groaning into the dirt, the duel could be over. But if they didn't, well, the fight might continue until someone stopped moving convincingly. Oh, and yes, there were documented cases of women dueling men, sometimes with modified rules, like the man fighting from a pit while the woman stood above with a club. Which sounds weird, but at least someone was trying to level the playing field. Literally. Let's rewind to the early medieval centuries, when legal systems were more of a polite suggestion and less of an actual framework. If someone accused you of stealing a pig, insulting their honor, or being secretly French, you didn't hire a lawyer. You sharpened something pointy and asked God to take sides. Thus entered the elegant institution of trial by combat, where truth was determined not by facts, but by whoever could swing a sword without immediately falling over. It started with Germanic tribes like the Franks, who believed that the gods, and later, God with a capital G, would never let an innocent man lose a fight. You could lie, cheat, and maybe have 3 goats too many. But once the swords came out, divine justice was expected to intervene. Eventually. Hopefully. Unless God was on lunch break. Trial by combat wasn't the only legal ordeal available. There was also trial by fire. Carry this red-hot iron and hope your skin doesn't melt. And trial by water. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent, but possibly dead. But trial by combat had a certain panache. It was dramatic, noisy, and gave you the faint illusion that skill mattered. Over time, the concept became so popular that it started showing up in actual law codes. The Lex Alamanorum and Lex Salica, basically the medieval equivalent of, "My uncle wrote this down so it must be legal," spelled out that if someone calls you a liar, and you're feeling especially confrontational, you may challenge them to a duel. Please bring your own weapons and try not to embarrass your ancestors. By the 12th century, trial by combat had worked its way into feudal courts. Nobles used it to resolve land disputes, marital accusations, and anything else that required a dramatic ending. There were rules, kind of. Duels had to be approved by a judge, which meant someone in robes and a hat said, "Yes, you may now attempt to legally bludgeon each other." The best part, if you refused to fight, you were automatically guilty. So your choices were pick up a weapon and pray for divine assistance, or go directly to jail. Or worse, back to peasant life. Picture a knight, majestic armor, flowing plume, eyes full of valor. Now picture that same knight gasping for air as he tries to wrestle another grown man out of a mud puddle while a squire holds their horse and pretends not to be emotionally scarred. Welcome to the world of knightly duels, where honor was on the line, but coordination was optional. Duels between knights were supposed to be refined affairs. The code of chivalry said you should fight with courage, fairness, and restraint. But once the helmets went on and visibility dropped to near zero, most of that went out the arrow slit. Suddenly, the fight turned into a loud, clunky slapfest between two armoured barrels. Before the match, both parties would declare their grievances. These ranged from, "You insulted my noble house," to, "Your dog looked at me weird." Judges or nobles oversaw the event, pretending this was all very dignified and not just professional grudge settling in metal pajamas. Weapons were agreed upon, usually longswords, maces, or lances, though sometimes the choice felt more like whatever's lying around. Occasionally, combatants would even switch mid-fight, usually because they dropped their first weapon and panicked. Armor was customized to be duel-friendly. This meant extra plating around the important bits, head, chest, ego, and occasionally a spike or two thrown in for flair. Mobility, however, suffered. Watching two knights fight was like watching two overstuffed wardrobes fall down a staircase, loud, slow, and full of unexpected injuries. Despite what romantic paintings suggest, most of these duels didn't end with a swift, noble strike. They ended when one knight collapsed from exhaustion, or got pinned to the ground and politely bludgeoned into agreement. Sometimes one would shout, "I yield," through a mouthful of helmet, assuming anyone could hear him under all the wheezing and clanking. Winning a duel didn't always mean killing your opponent. In fact, killing them could be frowned upon, especially if the whole thing started over something trivial, like a misheard insult or a misplaced glove. No one wanted to explain to the king why Sir Geoffrey was now fertilizer. Not every duel was between nobles in gleaming armor. Sometimes justice needed to be served between two peasants arguing over something serious, like whose turn it was to use the only working plough, or who spilled whose beer 3 market days ago. And when you're a medieval peasant, your options for conflict resolution are 1. Shout, 2. Throw something, or 3. Duel with whatever's closest and vaguely sharp. Welcome to the world of peasant duels. Same rage, fewer resources. Unlike knights, peasants couldn't afford custom armor, fancy weapons, or an audience with the local lord. Most duels happened in fields, alleyways, or behind the alehouse, places already covered in mud, livestock droppings, and the occasional unconscious witness. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about pride, and maybe a chicken. The weapons, creative, pitchforks, hoes, sticks, kitchen knives, heavy rocks, soup ladles. If it could be lifted and swung with emotion, it qualified. Some even fought with farming tools still covered in yesterday's turnip. One fight reportedly ended when a man was struck with a wheel of cheese. That's not legend. That's just Tuesday. There were rarely formal rules. Most fights started spontaneously and ended when one man gave up, passed out, or wandered off out of boredom. Occasionally, a village elder or drunk uncle would serve as referee, a role that mostly involved shouting, "That's enough, lads," while holding a half-eaten apple. Despite the chaos, these duels weren't always frowned upon. In some communities, a good, clean brawl was seen as therapeutic, like a medieval form of counselling, except instead of talking about your feelings, you tried to dislocate someone's shoulder with a shovel. Of course, not all fights ended harmlessly. Occasionally, someone did get seriously injured or die, usually from a head wound or sheer embarrassment. That's when local authorities stepped in, to remind everyone that killing was generally discouraged unless pre-approved by a noble or god. Still, peasant duels were a vital outlet in a world with few rights and even fewer coping mechanisms. They were loud, messy, irrational, much like life itself back then. And while you might not win land, honour or a title, you could win the argument, which to a medieval peasant was basically the same thing. When it came to medieval duels, your weapon said a lot about you. It told your opponent how serious you were, how rich you were, and in some cases, how recently you were interrupted while cooking stew. Let's start with the classics. The long sword was the go-to weapon for knights and well-funded squires. It looked impressive, balanced well, and could easily end a dispute, or at least leave a memorable dent in your opponent's armour. If you showed up with a long sword, you were basically saying, "I've trained for this and possibly own land." Then there was the mace, a charming little tool designed specifically for bludgeoning someone through their armour. The mace didn't bother with elegance. It was the medieval equivalent of a hammer, practical, brutal, and not great for subtle messages. Axes were common too, especially among those who enjoyed a bit of lumberjack flair in their fighting. Some were one-handed, others two-handed, depending on how dramatic you wanted your entrance to be. Axes had a certain flair. Nothing says, "This is personal," quite like swinging what used to be a firewood tool at someone's helmet. Now for the creative entries. If you were a peasant, you fought with whatever was lying around. Pitchforks, sticks, hoes, wooden clubs, and yes, even the occasional frying pan. There are actual records of people showing up to duels armed with kitchenware. One man famously wielded a skillet with such fury that the local priest made a note about it in the parish ledger, probably under unusual bludgeonings. Daggers were also popular for close quarters work. Some were sleek, others were glorified pointy triangles. In tight spaces like castle corridors or tavern basements, daggers let you settle your grievances without knocking over too many chairs. If you were really trying to make a statement, you might show up with a flail, the infamous chain and ball contraption. Flails were dramatic, terrifying, and nearly impossible to aim properly. There's a reason you don't see flail experts today. Most of them knock themselves out. You might think the medieval church, bastion of peace, piety, and moral guidance, would be firmly against the idea of people settling arguments with swords, sticks, or cast-iron cookware. You'd be half right. In theory, the church condemned violence. In practice, let's just say their position on duels was more "it depends" than "absolutely not." Trial by combat started as a holy concept. The belief was that God would ensure the righteous party would win the fight. After all, what better way to determine the truth than by seeing who could swing harder without falling over? Priests would often bless the combatants before the duel, not to stop them, but to make sure God had the proper paperwork in order. Church officials frequently oversaw formal duels, especially those sanctioned by courts. One monk was even known to keep score, not in any official capacity. He just found it interesting. The logic was simple. If a man survived the duel, then God clearly liked him more. If he didn't, well, divine judgment had spoken. And also, there was now a vacancy in the choir. However, not everyone in the church was on board. Popes periodically banned trial by combat, calling it barbaric, unchristian, and terrible for Sunday attendance. These bans were widely ignored, especially by nobles, who had a knack for hearing church decrees only when they agreed with them. Ironically, monasteries themselves weren't exactly violence-free zones either. There are records of monks getting into brawls over garden tools, book borrowing, and choir duties. One particularly spicy disagreement ended with a novice monk hurling a psalter at someone's head. Heavenly inspiration, weaponized. The church's real problem with duels wasn't the violence, it was the unpredictability. Sometimes, the wrong person won. And nothing ruins divine authority like God backing the guy who smells like ale and hasn't confessed in 6 years. Eventually, as legal systems matured, and as people kept bleeding on church property, clergy began pushing for less trial by axe and more trial by witness testimony. But in the meantime, the church kept a cautious distance, close enough to bless the fight, far enough not to get stabbed by accident. Because while forgiveness was eternal, the bruises were immediate. If you think medieval dueling was strictly a boys-only club, think again. Women too occasionally stepped into the ring, or the mud pit, or the cabbage field, and when they did, things got complicated. You see, medieval society had very specific ideas about women, delicate, modest, not ideally involved in public head injuries. But every so often, a woman had had enough, and the result was a duel that left both parties bruised, and the audience deeply confused. The most famous example comes from 14th century Germany, where local law actually allowed a woman to challenge a man, under one condition. The man had to stand in a hole, waist deep, with one arm tied behind his back. The woman, standing above ground, was given a club. He got one too, presumably to make it fair, though the whole thing feels more like a carnival game than a legal proceeding. And yet, it happened. More than once. Picture it. A man half buried in a pit, spinning in slow circles with a club, while a woman takes disciplined swings from above, pausing occasionally to adjust her apron. One German woodcut even shows a woman knocking a man flat, while a group of onlookers cheer in what can only be described as passive-aggressive amazement. These duels were rare, but they were legal. Women could also appoint a champion to fight in their name, usually a brother, cousin, or someone she hadn't annoyed recently. But if she fought for herself, that was taken seriously. No one was allowed to intervene. If you lost, you were guilty, and humiliated, probably both. Of course, dueling wasn't the only outlet for female rage. Feuds between women often played out in less organized ways. Poisonings, whispered accusations of witchcraft, and the occasional shoe-throwing incident at market. But every now and then, the system acknowledged that a woman had a right to settle things with a swing. These moments were awkward for medieval society. Women weren't supposed to be violent, assertive, or victorious. And yet here they were, club in hand, defending their reputation and rearranging someone's shoulder in the process. You may think medieval duels couldn't get more absurd, and then someone puts a pig on trial. Yes, really. In a world where legal systems were held together with Latin, duct tape, and divine assumption, animals were occasionally treated as legal persons, which meant they could be accused of crimes and punished, and in some cases, challenged to a duel. Let's be clear, most animal duels were not formal fights. They were more like executions with paperwork. If a pig bit a child, or a rooster crowed suspiciously at the wrong hour, they could be arrested, sometimes even dressed in tiny clothes, because nothing says justice like humiliating livestock before sentencing them to death. But occasionally, things escalated into genuine confrontation. In France, one particularly surreal 15th century event involved a man dueling a dog. The dog had allegedly attacked his master and then somehow fled to a monastery for sanctuary, because apparently this was an option. The duel was held in a public arena. The man wore full armor. The dog wore fur. The dog won. The crowd cheered. And no, we don't know how the man explained that to his descendants. Then there's the case of trained war animals. Horses, mastiffs, even the occasional bear, being pitted against criminals in mock combat displays. These weren't really duels in the legal sense, but they were public and violent, and someone always lost. Usually the guy not covered in fur and teeth. Why all this? Well, in the medieval mind, the world was a carefully balanced moral order. If a person could sin, so could a pig. If a man could stand trial, why not a goat? And if justice involved violence, then anything with limbs was fair game. Was this justice? Not exactly. Was it symbolic? Apparently. Was it weird? Absolutely. These cases are rare. But they weren't satire. They're documented in court records, drawn in medieval manuscripts, and discussed in serious theological debates. Somewhere, a monk once had to decide whether a donkey was acting under demonic influence or just having a bad Tuesday. Of all the ways medieval people tried to prove a point with sharp objects, jousting, or dueling on horseback, was arguably the most theatrical. It was part sport, part ritual, part "I hope my helmet fits," and entirely based on the idea that two men charging at each other with lances would somehow reveal the truth. Jousting was mostly the domain of knights. You needed a horse, armour, a squire or two, and the kind of financial stability that let you risk spinal injury for entertainment. In other words, not your average village lad with a shovel and a grudge. The format was simple. Two knights rode at each other from opposite ends of a tilt, a long wooden barrier, and tried to knock each other off using long, heavy lances. The goal was to hit your opponent squarely, ideally breaking your lance dramatically while staying upright. The secondary goal was to not fall off your horse like a sack of mail. Despite the pageantry, it was still a duel, and people got hurt. Concussions, broken bones, and the occasional impalement were part of the fun. One knight even got a splintered lance tip lodged through his eye and into his brain. He rode another 100 feet before falling off. Because medieval dignity demanded you finish your round before collapsing, there were rules, lots of them. You could only aim for certain parts of the body. Killing someone wasn't encouraged, but also not entirely discouraged, depending on the audience. And your horse had to be trained, armoured, and preferably not in a bad mood. Some duels on horseback weren't for sport, though. In certain disputes, especially among nobles, mounted combat was a genuine method of settling legal matters. Think courtroom drama, but with hooves and significantly more screaming. Of course, not everyone was graceful. Horses panicked, riders dropped lances. Occasionally, someone forgot to lower their visor and got a face full of wood. The spectacle might have looked noble, but most jousts ended with someone being helped off the field by a team of worried squires and one deeply judgmental stable boy. Somewhere between law, blood sport, and accidental theatre, duels quietly evolved into one of medieval Europe's favourite pastimes. Because if there's one thing the medieval crowd loved more than miracle plays and public executions, it was two angry men hitting each other in the name of honour while everyone else chewed on roasted turnips. By the 13th century, duels weren't just about resolving disputes. They were events. Villagers would gather. Nobles would invite guests. Merchants sold snacks. Sometimes there was even music. It was less grievance settlement and more medieval fight night. Duels drew all social classes, from peasants standing in the mud to lords in velvet trying not to look too excited. Clergymen were there too, officially to pray, unofficially to place bets. After all, God moves in mysterious ways, but sometimes he moves in favour of the guy with the better footwork. It wasn't uncommon for duels to be held in large open areas, town squares, castle courtyards, or special dueling grounds. Temporary stands were built, beer flowed, bread was thrown, occasionally at the fighters. And when the fight started, the crowd watched every swing, grunt, and misstep with rapt attention. A clean hit drew cheers, a dramatic tumble got gasps, and if someone lost a finger, well, you'd better believe that story lived on in taverns for the next 6 winters. The entertainment value wasn't just in the violence, it was in the characters. Some duelists had reputations. The bold young squire, the grizzled war veteran, the guy who once fought a goose and lost. People came for the drama, the spectacle, the possibility that someone might trip over their own sword and become a local legend. Occasionally, fights were so underwhelming that the audience turned on both participants. Booing was involved. Tomatoes, if in season. One chronicler noted a duel where both men refused to engage for over 20 minutes, resulting in the crowd storming the field and declaring a sheep the moral victor. In time, the duel became less about truth and more about the show. It was proof that justice didn't have to be efficient. It just had to be loud, messy, and preferably shirtless. Because if you're going to settle a legal matter, why not invite the entire town and make a day of it? Not all duels were local tavern scuffles over who stole whose bucket. Some were legendary affairs, remembered not just for the bruises but for actually shaping historical events, or at least mildly adjusting them while everyone else stood around pretending it mattered more than it did. Take the 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, arguably the most famous trial by combat in French history. Carouges accused Legris of a rather serious crime, assaulting his wife, and when the courts couldn't figure it out, they did what any reasonable legal system would: gave both men sharp weapons and told them to let God sort it out. The duel was public, royal sanctioned, and attended by King Charles VI himself, who, by all accounts, was far too excited about it. Thousands came to watch. Horses were mounted, lances were broken, armour was dented, and in the end, Carouges killed Legris, which legally meant his wife was telling the truth. That's how truth worked back then. Whoever lived longer was clearly the honest one. The event was so significant that it inspired books, films, and one very nervous change to French law shortly afterward. Trial by combat was quietly discouraged when people realised justice by stabbing might not be the most reliable system. Then there's the 1467 duel between the Burgundian champion Jacques Laleng and a Spanish knight, a fight held for diplomacy, glory, and the kind of national pride that involves punching each other with sticks. They fought for hours before it ended in a draw, a polite way of saying, everyone's too tired to keep pretending this is fun. Duels weren't always so grand. One monk challenged another to single combat over who should be choir director. Another pair of nobles fought because one sneezed during the other's toast. These weren't world-changing moments, but they do serve as a reminder that medieval conflict resolution was roughly one sideways glance away from carnage. Some duels shaped kingdoms, others just shaped noses, but they all shared the same logic. When words fail and evidence is lacking, put on some armour, grab a stick, and hope your opponent skipped breakfast. In the Middle Ages, words mattered. A little too much. Especially if those words suggested someone's honour, parentage, or bathing habits were less than stellar. Because while modern insults might result in a strongly worded email, medieval insults could very easily end in a legal duel and a broken collarbone. Insults in medieval society weren't just rude, they were often actionable offences. Calling someone a liar, a thief, or, heaven forbid, a coward could be considered defamation. And the only acceptable response? Challenge them to a duel and let your sword explain your feelings more clearly. But insulting someone wasn't as simple as shouting, "You stink," across a field. There was an art to it, a certain flourish. This was a time when people took 10 minutes to say good morning, and another 5 to accuse your uncle of sheep theft. Some favoured the direct approach. A classic insult might sound like, "You are a knave and a scoundrel, unworthy of your title and your trousers." Others preferred the poetic route, accusing rivals of being spawn of a flea-bitten sow, or lower than the worms beneath the dung heap. The more syllables, the better. Nobles had their own version of verbal warfare. Instead of yelling, they wrote passive-aggressive letters in elaborate calligraphy, carefully insulting one another's courage, fashion, or genealogy, then sealing it with wax and sending it on a horse. Truly, the most elegant form of pre-fight trash talk. And if things escalated, as they always did, a formal challenge was issued. Sometimes in writing, sometimes in front of witnesses. A glove might be thrown, a goblet might be overturned. One gentleman even slapped his rival with a fish, which sounds silly until you realise it probably still had teeth. Interestingly, refusing to respond to an insult was sometimes worse than the insult itself. Backing down marked you as dishonourable, weak, or, worst of all, boring. The medieval world was deeply obsessed with reputation. A single well-placed insult could ruin a name, invite a duel, or start a decades-long family feud. It was dangerous territory, filled with flowery language and very real consequences. So, you've insulted someone's lineage, spilled their ale, or looked at their sheep in a suspiciously admiring way. Now you're standing in a muddy field, armed with a sword you barely remember how to hold, and wondering how you ended up here. Let's talk strategy. Step 1. Show up. This might sound obvious, but in the Middle Ages, refusing to duel could make you legally guilty by default. You'd lose your honor, your reputation, and possibly your left ear, depending on local sentencing trends. So unless you enjoy public shaming and/or ear loss, attendance is strongly encouraged. Step 2. Size up your opponent. Are they armored like a walking pantry? Are they already sweating through their visor? Are they nervously praying or quietly muttering something that sounds like a last will and testament? Great. You're either in trouble or about to become a legend. Step 3. Know your weapons. If you're fighting with a longsword, aim for joints. If it's maces, just swing until something makes a cracking noise. If you're both armed with daggers, congratulations. You're about to have a very personal, very awkward wrestling match in front of everyone you've ever met. Step 4. Use psychology. Shouting random words can be surprisingly effective. One knight once screamed, "turnips," before charging. His opponent hesitated just long enough to get flattened. Confidence matters. So does being confusing. Step 5. Don't trip. Easier said than done. Mud, armor, and panic make excellent co-conspirators. Falling flat on your face in the first 30 seconds of combat guarantees a place in local history as a cautionary tale. And finally, if you're going to lose, lose memorably. Shout something dramatic, swing with flair. Make your final move so ridiculous that ballads are written about it. One man once threw his sword and yelled, "To the moon with you!" It didn't help him win, but children sang about it for weeks. Because while winning earns you honor, losing with style earns you immortality, or at least a few exaggerated stories at the tavern. In the end, dueling wasn't just about victory. It was about pride, performance, and giving the audience something to talk about. Preferably not your funeral. By now, you might be under the impression that duels were all about honor, fairness, and dramatic exits. But sometimes, more often than anyone wanted to admit, duels were less about justice and more about getting rid of someone conveniently while looking very noble about it. Welcome to the darker side of dueling. Legalized murder, now in ceremonial wrapping. Let's say you're a nobleman. You've got a rival. He's richer, louder, and his falcon is clearly better trained. You can't just assassinate him. That's uncivilized. So instead, you provoke him into a duel. Maybe you insult his wife's embroidery. Maybe you accuse him of watering down his wine. Eventually, he gets mad enough to challenge you, or you challenge him. Either way, someone's not coming back from this, and it's all perfectly legal. Because here's the thing. In many places and time periods, duels were state-approved outlets for homicide. As long as you followed the protocol, issued a challenge, had a witness, said something vaguely about honor, you could beat a man to death in public and everyone would just nod solemnly and say, "Ah yes, justice." This system was especially popular when inconvenient people needed to disappear with plausible deniability. Rival claim to your land? Duel. Political opponent gaining too much favor? Duel. That one baron who keeps asking questions about where all the tax money went? Definitely duel. And if you lost the duel? Well, too bad. You're dead and therefore obviously guilty. If you won? Congratulations. You're alive, innocent, and probably got to keep the other guy's horse. Some duelists took things further by hiring professional champions to fight on their behalf, basically outsourcing your honor to someone with better biceps. If the hired muscle happened to kill the opponent quickly and dramatically, even better. Less mess, more applause. Of course, this all worked best if the duel looked official. You needed the robes, the oaths, the pre-fight prayers. That way, when someone's head came off, everyone could agree it was a tragic but righteous conclusion. Not just another Tuesday with extra blood. Because in the Middle Ages, murder was still illegal, unless you called it a duel. Like many things from the Middle Ages, plague masks, leech-based medicine, and the belief that bathing was suspicious, dueling eventually lost its shine. By the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, duels began to fade from public life. Not because people stopped being petty, violent, or easily offended, but because society started inventing slightly less ridiculous ways to solve problems, like evidence and courts, and the idea that maybe we shouldn't settle arguments by hitting each other with sharp objects in front of a priest. The rise of centralized governments played a big role. Kings, emperors, and whoever was shouting loudest in parliament didn't love the idea of private citizens settling grievances with sword fights. Too messy, too public, and occasionally someone important lost. That was awkward for everyone. Also, as legal systems matured, the church finally followed through on centuries of vague disapproval. They began cracking down on trial by combat with actual consequences, like excommunication, which was basically the medieval version of getting blocked by God. There was also the small problem of logistics. Dueling took time, gear, horses, armor, and a crowd willing to stand around for hours while two men slowly bled into a cabbage patch. Not exactly efficient, especially when judges realized they could just ask questions, examine documents, and come to a conclusion that didn't require anyone to lose a kneecap. By the 16th century, dueling had largely transitioned into a gentleman's sport. Less muddy, more fashionable. Pistols replaced swords. Rules became more elaborate. And while it was still a good way to get yourself dramatically killed, at least you were doing it in tights and with excellent posture. Eventually, even that wore out its welcome. Laws were passed, public sentiment shifted, and duels moved from respectable legal action to weird thing your uncle did once in college. Today, trial by combat is mostly confined to historical reenactments, obscure legal debates, and that one guy online insisting it's still legal in Idaho. And so, the medieval duel died as it lived, loudly, dramatically, and slightly confused about what it was supposed to accomplish. In the medieval countryside, where physicians were rare and hospitals even rarer, the peasant healer stood as the first and often only line of defense against illness. These healers, usually women, were deeply rooted in their communities. They were not formally trained, but their knowledge came from tradition, observation, and oral transmission passed down through generations. Their remedies were crafted from the natural world: plants, roots, flowers, and minerals found in the fields and woods surrounding the village. A healer's home often doubled as her practice. Inside, bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, drying in the smoke of the hearth. Shelves were lined with jars of crushed bark, animal fats, beeswax, and oils. She might prepare a compress of comfrey to reduce swelling or boil willow bark to ease pain, long before anyone understood that it contained salicin, a precursor to modern aspirin. Remedies were experimental but guided by centuries of inherited wisdom. Spirituality and belief played an inseparable role in healing. Illness was not always seen as a purely physical condition. It could be the result of sin, a curse, or malevolent spirits. Healers would recite blessings or prayers alongside their treatments. Some used incantations, charms, or ritual gestures to protect the soul as well as the body. Healing, in this sense, was holistic, tending to the person's physical pain and spiritual unrest simultaneously. Despite their value, peasant healers walked a fine line. Their knowledge was respected and sought after, but it could also arouse suspicion. In times of misfortune, such as a failed harvest or sudden death, the community's gratitude could quickly turn into fear. A woman who healed with herbs could easily be accused of witchcraft if her remedies failed, or if her behavior was perceived as odd or secretive. Nonetheless, for the average villager, the healer was indispensable. She delivered babies, mended broken bones, soothed fevers, and comforted the dying. Her presence offered hope in a world with limited options. While her cures may not always have worked by modern standards, They represented a blend of empirical observation, faith, and a deep understanding of the natural world. In an age of uncertainty, the peasant healer was a symbol of resilience and care. In the deeply spiritual and often superstitious world of medieval peasants, illness was not just a matter of failing health, it was a potential sign of spiritual attack or evil influence. One of the most curious and widespread methods for defending against these unseen forces was the creation of witch bottles, small containers filled with protective items, meant to trap or repel harmful magic. These bottles were typically crafted from glass or stoneware, though clay vessels were common in rural areas. Inside, the healer, or sometimes the afflicted person themselves, would place a variety of symbolic items: iron nails, hair or nail clippings from the victim, red threads, pins, herbs, and even urine. The urine was believed to attract the attention of the witch responsible for the affliction, and once she was lured in, the sharp or rusty contents of the bottle would wound or trap her spirit, rendering her powerless. After being prepared, the witch bottle would be buried upside down near the entrance of a home, under the hearth, or beneath the threshold. Placement was key. It had to intercept dark forces before they entered the household. If illness persisted or worsened, another bottle might be made, or the original might be dug up, altered, and reburied with stronger ingredients. These objects were not rare. Across medieval Europe, especially in England and Germany, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of them, often still sealed, their contents untouched for centuries. Their presence is a quiet testament to the fears that haunted the minds of everyday people. The fear that sickness came not only from cold weather or dirty water, but from curses, jealousy, or unseen spiritual warfare. In tandem with witch bottles, peasants sometimes hid apotropaic marks, symbols carved into doors, lintels, or walls, to ward off evil. These could include circles, pentagrams, or the interlaced letters VV, invoking the protection of the Virgin Mary. Such signs were not mere decoration. They were silent guardians, protecting families from illness and misfortune. Though they may seem strange now, these practices reflect a worldview where illness and health were deeply entwined with belief. For the medieval peasant, to be protected physically meant being protected spiritually, and that meant taking no chances with the forces beyond sight. For medieval peasants, nature was not just the backdrop to daily life. It was the pharmacy, the healer's library, and the silent teacher. When illness struck, those who worked the land turned to it for relief, relying on generations of accumulated knowledge about which plants helped and which ones harmed. In a time when formal medicine was inaccessible and often misunderstood, herbs were among the most trusted allies. The meadows and forests surrounding villages were rich with medicinal flora. Yarrow was gathered for wounds, known to stop bleeding and promote healing. Chamomile soothed upset stomachs and helped with sleep. Mugwort was burned to ward off illness, or used in poultices for aching joints. Nettle, despite its sting, was boiled into teas that relieved joint pain and encouraged urination, flushing the body of what they called bad humours. Peasant healers knew when to harvest each plant, under the right moon phase, after the morning dew, or before the solstice. Timing mattered. The potency of a plant was believed to be influenced by the stars, the season, and the ritual surrounding its collection. It wasn't just science. It was a sacred practice. Herbs were often combined with rituals or prayers. A healer might say a charm while crushing the leaves, or bless the water used in a herbal infusion. The act of preparing the remedy was almost as important as the ingredients themselves. This blending of natural and spiritual treatment reflected the belief that illness had both a bodily and a mystical cause. In the absence of written texts, knowledge was passed orally. A healer might teach her daughter, apprentice, or a trusted neighbour the art of identifying safe mushrooms from poisonous ones, or which root should be boiled and which should be dried. Recipes were memorized, not written. Some families had their own secret blends, closely guarded for generations. Though they lacked microscopes or modern chemistry, peasant communities developed an intuitive understanding of the body and nature's ability to help it. And while not every remedy cured, many were surprisingly effective. Modern science has confirmed the antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties of several herbs they used. Herbalism was more than a skill. It was a quiet, persistent form of survival and self-reliance. In the shadow of plagues and poor harvests, a bundle of dried plants could mean the difference between hope and despair. Not all medieval peasant remedies were based on herbs and prayer. Many treatments relied on a deeper, older tradition, one that believed animals held special properties capable of drawing out disease, neutralizing curses, or restoring balance to the body. Among the most curious of these were frog poultices and toad-based cures, once commonly practiced across rural Europe. The logic was symbolic as much as physical. A live frog might be pressed against a sore throat or infected wound, then released into a stream. It was believed that the frog would absorb the illness and carry it away with the current. In more severe cases, frogs were cut open and placed directly on the body. The transfer of disease into the animal, often accompanied by a spoken charm, was thought to trick the illness into leaving its human host. Toad powder, made from dried and crushed toads, was sometimes used in salves or sprinkled into wounds. Though this might seem grim, it was born of the belief that like repels like. If the ailment was caused by something unnatural or venomous, only a creature with similarly magical properties could combat it. Beyond frogs and toads, snakes, mice, and even spiders had their place in folk medicine. Spider webs, for example, were used to bind wounds and promote clotting, something modern science now acknowledges as mildly effective due to the presence of vitamin K in the silk. Mice boiled in milk were fed to children with persistent coughs. Snake skins were worn around the neck as talismans against fever. These treatments weren't random. They were embedded in a worldview where disease was seen as something external, something that could be transferred, expelled, or warded off using symbolic replacements. In a time when infections could spread rapidly and treatment options were limited, even the most unorthodox cure was worth trying. Animals were also believed to offer clues to a person's health. If a dog refused to lie near someone, or if a cat avoided a child's bed, it was a sign that death might be near. Conversely, a bird tapping at the window could mean recovery, or in some cases, divine warning. In the absence of certainty, peasants trusted the signs nature gave them. Their world was filled with quiet rituals, small gestures, and the enduring hope that somewhere within the body of a frog, a cure might be hiding. In medieval peasant life, the sky was not merely a source of light and weather. It was a guiding force that influenced everything from planting crops to treating disease. Health was thought to rise and fall in rhythm with the movements of the moon, the stars, and the changing heavens. To heal the body, one first had to understand the sky. The moon, in particular, was considered a powerful agent in the body's balance. Many healers believed that bleeding a patient or applying a remedy at the wrong time in the lunar cycle could do more harm than good. Treatments were carefully timed with the waxing or waning moon. A waxing moon, growing toward fullness, was associated with strength and regeneration, making it ideal for taking medicines to build vitality. A waning moon, on the other hand, was linked with purification, best suited for purging illness or extracting bad humors. This celestial logic extended to surgeries, births, and even the cutting of hair or nails. Doing these things when the moon was in the wrong sign was thought to bring bad luck or delayed healing. The body, like the land, was seen as a vessel tuned to nature's rhythms, and the moon was its clock. Beyond the moon, astrology played a subtle but persistent role. Though full horoscopic readings were more the domain of the educated elite, peasants were often aware of basic star signs and planetary influences. A healer might consult an almanac, or rely on local law to determine when Mars was ascendant, often avoided for bloodletting due to its fiery and violent nature, or when Venus, associated with moisture and fertility, could favour healing. The zodiac man, a popular illustration found in medieval calendars and manuscripts, showed which parts of the body were ruled by which zodiac sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, and so on. Healers might use this figure to decide when and where to treat a patient, or whether to wait until the stars were better aligned. While today such ideas may seem distant, for the medieval peasant they provided order in a world of uncertainty. The sky was not just distant decoration, it was a living map of invisible forces, offering structure, guidance, and hope. To watch the heavens was to seek healing not just from nature, but from the very rhythm of the universe itself. In a world where sickness could strike without warning and medicine was uncertain, medieval peasants often turned to the divine. Healing, for many, came not from herbs or stars, but from the blessings of the saints. Their bones, clothing, or even a piece of their coffin were believed to hold miraculous powers. These sacred items, relics, were at the center of spiritual healing, offering hope when all earthly remedies had failed. Relics were kept in churches, monasteries, and sometimes even in private homes of the nobility. Pilgrims travelled long distances to visit shrines said to house the remains of saints known for healing. St. Thomas Becket's blood, St. Cuthbert's incorrupt body, and a piece of St. Catherine's finger were all sought after. Simply touching these relics, or even standing in their presence, was believed to bring healing to the faithful. In local parishes, more modest relics, such as a drop of oil from a saint's lamp or a scrap of cloth that had touched a shrine, were sometimes made available to peasants. Priests would bless the sick using these relics, or the items might be placed on the afflicted area of the body during prayer. The belief was not in the object itself, but in the spiritual power it carried through divine association. Often, peasants would also light candles to a specific saint, pray novenas, or make offerings in the hope of healing. Saint Sebastian was invoked during times of plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, and Saint Roch for wounds and pestilence. These connections were not random. They reflected both the saint's life and the miracles they were believed to have performed after death. For those too ill or too poor to travel, local rituals sometimes replicated the power of relics. A healer might wrap a charm with a saint's name written on parchment and tie it around a limb. If no relic was available, even invoking the saint's name in a whispered prayer could bring comfort. While science was still centuries away from providing clear explanations for illness, the veneration of relics offered peasants something equally powerful: faith. In a harsh world, to believe that a higher force cared for the suffering brought strength, and sometimes, according to many, it brought healing. In medieval peasant life, words carried power, not just in prayers or church rituals, but in the whispered charms and softly spoken incantations used to guard against sickness and misfortune. Healing was as much about protection as it was about remedy, and for many, the first defense came not from medicine, but from a charm worn around the neck, or a phrase passed quietly from mother to child. Charms could take many forms. Some were written words, inscribed in Latin or the local dialect on parchment or wood, then folded and worn in a small pouch close to the body. Others were spoken aloud, repeated a specific number of times, often 3 or 7, sacred numbers in both folk belief and Christian tradition. The phrases might call upon God, saints, angels, or nature spirits, depending on the healer's background and local customs. Talismans were physical objects believed to hold protective power. They could be as simple as a wolf's tooth, a stone with a natural hole, or a coin blessed at a shrine. A popular belief held that if you carried an object struck by lightning, it would protect you from illness caused by evil air or spiritual harm. Iron, too, was thought to repel malevolent forces. Nails driven into doorways, or tiny iron knives tucked beneath pillows, were used to keep sickness at bay. Children and newborns were often given extra protection. A cord with blessed beads, a scrap of St. John's wort, or a wax figure of a saint might be sewn into their clothing or hung over their cradle. Illness in children was often blamed on the evil eye or malicious spirits, and charms were seen as essential to keep such forces away. Not all charms were public. Some were deeply private, passed down within families and never spoken aloud to strangers. To reveal the words was believed to lessen their power. In many villages, the healer's reputation rested as much on these secret charms as on her knowledge of herbs. Though we might now classify such objects as superstition, they represented a profound belief in the invisible web of forces that surrounded daily life. For the medieval peasant, healing was not just a response to illness, it was a lifelong act of guarding the soul and body with every means available. While much of medieval healing took place within homes or through individual remedies, the rhythm of the village year also provided opportunities for communal rituals and seasonal cures. These events blurred the line between medicine, religion, and tradition. They were collective moments where the entire community participated in seeking protection, renewal, and healing, both physical and spiritual. The changing of seasons was considered a vulnerable time for the body and spirit. Transitions like spring equinox, harvest, or midwinter were believed to weaken the natural defenses of the body, making people more susceptible to illness. To counteract this, villagers would participate in rituals designed to cleanse the body or ward off harmful forces for the coming months. One common practice was the burning of herbs during seasonal festivals, particularly mugwort, juniper, and wormwood. The smoke was believed to purify homes and protect inhabitants from disease. Families would walk through the smoke, pass their children through it, or even wave it over livestock. This wasn't simply symbolic, it was a deeply rooted belief in the protective essence of nature. In some regions, holy wells or sacred springs were visited during certain feast days. People would drink or bathe in the waters, believed to be blessed by saints or touched by divine power. Stones were placed near the water's edge as offerings, or strips of cloth, called clooties, were tied to nearby trees while prayers were whispered. These were acts of devotion and healing in equal measure. Feast days of healing saints, such as St. Blaise, known for protecting throats, or St. Hildegard, associated with health and herbal knowledge, were marked by special masses and blessings. Sick members of the community might receive holy water or be anointed with oil during these times. In some villages, entire households would walk around the parish boundaries, reciting protective prayers to safeguard their land from disease and misfortune, a tradition known as beating the bounds. These communal acts helped reinforce both spiritual protection and social cohesion. When sickness was a constant threat, healing wasn't only an individual pursuit, it was something to be shared, celebrated, and safeguarded together. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of the village, these rituals offered a powerful reminder that health, like faith, was something best nurtured in community. In the world of medieval peasants, healing was never just a question of survival. It was also a delicate dance between what was accepted by the church and what risked being condemned as heresy. For all their reliance on charms, herbs, relics, and prayers, peasants also lived in fear that stepping too far outside accepted norms might invite accusations of witchcraft. This fear was not unfounded. Many village healers, particularly women, found themselves caught between reverence and suspicion. A woman who could ease childbirth or cure fevers might be praised one year and denounced the next. If a recovery failed, or if a neighbour's cow died soon after a remedy was given, whispers could grow into charges. Misfortune had to have a reason, and when it struck, the healer's power became a convenient target. Church authorities tolerated many traditional practices, especially those wrapped in Christian imagery or invoking saints, but they also drew firm lines. Astrology, invocations to unknown spirits, and the use of secret words or symbols were viewed with increasing suspicion. Healing that did not rely explicitly on divine intercession risked being labelled as a cult. The line between folk medicine and forbidden magic was not clearly defined, and it often shifted with the politics of the time. Witch trials, while not yet at their later peak, did occur in the later Middle Ages. Healers were sometimes accused of having made pacts with dark forces or using their knowledge to curse rather than cure. Some were subjected to questioning, public penance, or worse. Others simply faded into silence, choosing to no longer share their remedies out of fear. And yet, despite these dangers, folk healing endured. Communities still turned to their local wise women and herbalists, still tied ribbons at sacred springs, and still buried witch bottles beneath their doorsteps. Faith and fear coexisted. The church might warn against superstition, but the cry of a feverish child or the spread of illness across a field of labourers made people reach for whatever hope they had. In this fragile balance between heaven and earth, between accepted belief and forbidden knowledge, medieval peasants navigated the mystery of illness with courage. Healing was never just about the body. It was about survival, trust, and belief in a world where the unseen shaped everything. The plague doctor mask remains one of the most haunting symbols of pre-modern medicine. With its elongated beak, dark round eyes, and waxed cloak, it has become a visual shorthand for the terror and mystery surrounding the Black Death. Today, it's often used in horror films, costumes, and dark art. But in its own time, the mask was not intended to frighten. It was instead a desperate attempt at protection, both physical and spiritual, in a world that had no clear understanding of contagion. The mask first emerged in the 17th century, though the Black Death itself had devastated Europe centuries earlier in the 14th century. By the time the beaked mask came into use, physicians had begun to develop more structured theories about disease transmission, though many of these ideas were still deeply flawed. Chief among them was the concept of miasma, the belief that diseases were spread by bad air, foul-smelling and invisible vapours that could enter the body through the nose and mouth. To counter this, plague doctors wore masks filled with aromatic substances. The beak was not a stylistic choice, but a functional one. It created space for a small chamber to hold herbs, spices, dried flowers, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked cloth. Common ingredients included lavender, mint, camphor, and cloves, anything believed to purify the air or drive away the invisible poison. The lenses in the eyes were often made of glass, sealed to prevent contaminated air from reaching the eyes. The rest of the outfit was equally intentional. A long waxed coat, gloves, boots, and a staff, which allowed the doctor to examine patients without touching them directly. To those who saw the mask approaching, it often meant death was near. These doctors visited the sick, marked homes under quarantine, and recorded death tolls. They were not miracle workers, but their presence was a grim reassurance that someone still dared to enter the homes of the afflicted. Far from a theatrical costume, the plague doctor's mask was a product of fear, hope, and the limits of contemporary knowledge. It represented the best efforts of early medicine to face an enemy it could barely comprehend, a mask made not for vanity, but for survival. The image of the plague doctor, robed in black with a beaked mask and staff in hand, didn't appear until centuries after the Black Death first tore through Europe in the 14th century. The earliest mentions of such doctors in uniform appear during later outbreaks, especially in 17th century Italy and France. By this time, cities had begun appointing official plague doctors, physicians paid by municipalities to treat the infected, record the dead, and oversee public health measures. These men were not always the most skilled or experienced doctors. In fact, many were young, poorly trained, or foreign practitioners willing to take on the deadly work that others avoided. The job was high risk and often thankless, but in some cases it offered steady pay or career advancement. For poorer cities and remote regions, even minimal medical presence was considered better than none. The plague doctor uniform was formalised in 1619 by Charles de Lorme, personal physician to several French royals. He designed it to protect the wearer from miasma, the supposed poisonous air that was believed to carry disease. The outfit included a full-length waxed coat, leather gloves, leggings, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. It was topped off with the now infamous beaked mask and a cane used to examine patients from a distance. The role of the plague doctor was grim. They were tasked with entering quarantined homes, inspecting the sick and dying, administering basic remedies, and keeping meticulous records of infections and deaths. In some areas, They also performed autopsies or helped enforce quarantine measures, ensuring no one left infected zones without permission. Despite their official titles, many plague doctors had little ability to cure the disease. Treatments were rudimentary at best: bloodletting, herbal tinctures, vinegar washes, and purging. Most relied on prevention and documentation rather than recovery. Still, their presence represented an effort, however limited, to respond to a terrifying and mysterious threat. As the plague continued to ravage communities, the Doctor in Black became a familiar and deeply unsettling figure. To those watching from their windows, the arrival of a plague doctor was a sign that illness had already taken root. It was a living reminder of both society's vulnerability and its determination to resist. At the core of the plague doctor's mask was the belief in protection through scent and purification. The long beak was not ornamental. It was designed to create space for aromatic substances, thought to cleanse the air before it reached the lungs. In an age without microscopes or knowledge of bacteria, disease was widely believed to travel through miasma, or bad air. This theory shaped much of medieval and early modern medical thinking, and the beaked mask was its most iconic application. The beak typically contained a mixture of dried herbs, flowers, and resins. Some of the most common ingredients included lavender, rose petals, mint, cloves, myrrh, cinnamon, and camphor. These were not chosen at random. Many were associated with cleanliness, sanctity, or strong, pleasant smells that might counteract foul odors. Others, like vinegar-soaked sponges or juniper berries, were believed to carry antiseptic properties, though this understanding was purely observational and lacked a scientific basis. These ingredients were tightly packed into the curved beak of the mask, which acted like a primitive air filter. Some doctors changed the contents daily. Others adjusted them according to the symptoms they encountered or the severity of the local outbreak. The idea was that by breathing in purified air, the doctor could avoid infection. The reality, however, was more complicated. While it's easy to dismiss this practice as misguided, it's important to recognize its logic within the context of the time. The miasma theory, though flawed, was based on consistent observation. Foul smells often accompanied disease and decay. In many cities, death followed where the stench was strongest. The mask, therefore, was both a medical tool and a form of psychological armor, a barrier against a terrifying and invisible enemy. In some cases, these herbal mixtures may have provided minor relief. Certain herbs, like clove and thyme, do have antimicrobial properties. Others may have helped soothe the doctor's nerves or mask the overwhelming stench of death. But the beak was never truly a barrier to infection. It was a hopeful gesture in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Despite its limitations, the beaked mask remains one of the earliest examples of protective gear in medical history. It marked a shift, however small, toward the idea that disease could be blocked, contained, or controlled through human effort. While the beaked mask is the most recognizable part of the plague doctor's attire, it was only one component of a carefully constructed uniform designed to protect the physician from exposure. Every element, from the hat to the boots, served a specific purpose rooted in the prevailing theories of disease transmission, especially the belief that illness could spread through touch and corrupted air. Plague doctors wore a long, waxed cloak made of leather or heavy canvas, often coated in animal fat or wax to repel bodily fluids. The cloak covered the body from neck to ankle and was sometimes sealed at the sleeves to prevent contamination from reaching the skin. Underneath, multiple layers of fabric provided insulation and a further barrier. Thick gloves protected the hands, while tall leather boots shielded the legs and feet from contaminated surfaces. Covering the head was a wide-brimmed hat, often made of stiff material or leather. This hat not only completed the look, but also served to distinguish plague doctors from the general public, a necessary feature in a time of fear and chaos. The hat identified the wearer as a medical official, allowing them access to quarantined zones and patient households. Perhaps the most overlooked part of the uniform was the staff. Usually made of wood and measuring several feet in length, the staff allowed the doctor to maintain physical distance. It was used to lift the clothing of patients, examine wounds, check for signs of life, or even signal instructions to those nearby. In some cases, it served as a symbol of authority, helping doctors enforce quarantine measures or clear a path through crowds. The full ensemble, when worn together, created a complete physical barrier between the doctor and the outside world. Though its effectiveness against disease transmission was limited, since the real culprits, fleas and bacteria, were unknown, the uniform did offer a level of psychological reassurance, both to doctors and the communities they served. In the midst of widespread panic, the uniform established order and protocol, creating the appearance of control in the face of an invisible threat. It also marked a turning point in medical history. The beginning of personal protective equipment, centuries before the germ theory of disease would finally rewrite the rules of medicine. Though plague doctors were often portrayed as figures of authority and knowledge, the reality of their medical practices was far more uncertain. Without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, treatments were based on humoral theory, miasma, and long-standing medical traditions inherited from classical antiquity. As a result, much of what plague doctors prescribed was experimental, symbolic, or rooted in hope rather than science. The most common medical explanation for illness at the time was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was believed to occur when these fluids were imbalanced, so many treatments focused on restoring equilibrium. This led to the widespread use of bloodletting, either through the application of leeches or the cutting of veins. Patients were also given emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to purge the system. Herbal remedies played a significant role. Doctors and healers turned to plants such as angelica, sage, rosemary, and garlic, believed to possess purifying or strengthening properties. These herbs were prepared as infusions, poultices, or powders, and administered orally or applied directly to swellings. Some patients were instructed to drink vinegar and rosewater, while others burned herbs in their homes to cleanse the air. Infected swellings, known as buboes, were sometimes lanced and drained, though this procedure often led to secondary infections. Another common method was to place a pigeon or toad on the buboes, under the belief that the animal would draw out the poison. In extreme cases, hot irons were applied to the sores, a desperate and painful attempt to cauterize the disease. Treatments varied not only by region, but also by the status of the patient. Wealthier individuals might receive more attention and a wider range of remedies, while the poor were often left with basic interventions or prayer. Despite these efforts, recovery was rare once the plague had taken hold. Most of the treatments offered limited or no real benefit, and many may have even hastened death. Still, the work of plague doctors represented an early attempt at organized public health response. Their presence gave structure to chaos and embodied the belief, however imperfect, that something could be done in the face of overwhelming loss. As plague swept through towns and cities, the primary goal of authorities was not just to treat the sick, but to prevent the disease from spreading further. This led to the development of early public health strategies, and at the heart of them was quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, a reference to the period ships were required to remain anchored outside ports before passengers and cargo could enter. Plague doctors often played a direct role in enforcing quarantine measures. They inspected the sick, identified houses with infections, and ordered the sealing of buildings. A marked house, sometimes with a painted red cross or a warning nailed to the door, was a sign that no one inside was allowed to leave. Food and supplies would be passed through windows, if at all. These households became islands within their own communities, surrounded by silence and fear. Entire neighborhoods could be cordoned off. City gates were locked, and travel between regions was heavily restricted. In Venice, one of the first official quarantine stations, or lazarettos, was established on an island in the lagoon. Those showing symptoms, or even suspected of exposure, were relocated there to await recovery or death. Plague doctors were sometimes stationed in lazarettos themselves. tasked with monitoring patients and documenting deaths. Their records became essential not only for tracking the spread of disease, but also for understanding its patterns, however little they truly understood its cause. Many doctors fell ill themselves. Though their protective clothing may have offered some degree of physical separation, it was no match for the true agents of disease, fleas and bacteria, unknown to science at the time. These measures, though harsh, were not without effectiveness. Reducing contact between the healthy and the sick, even unknowingly, helped slow the spread of infection. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Isolation, suspicion, and desperation gripped communities. People fled cities, abandoned loved ones, or turned on neighbours in fear. Quarantine reflected the grim reality of a world without cures. It was a strategy born not of knowledge, but of necessity. And within its confines, the plague doctor became both a symbol of help and a reminder that survival often came at the cost of separation and sacrifice. In the public imagination of the time, the figure of the plague doctor existed in a strange and often uncomfortable space. They were part healer, part official, and part omen. Their appearance, cloaked, masked, and silent, made them instantly recognizable, but also deeply unsettling. For many, the arrival of a plague doctor in their neighborhood did not signal hope. It signaled that death was already present. The medieval worldview was steeped in religious belief, superstition, and symbolism. Illness was often perceived as divine punishment or a consequence of sin. The plague, with its rapid and indiscriminate devastation, seemed to support this view. In this context, the plague doctor's eerie costume and tools took on a near mystical quality. Some believed the masks themselves held magical properties. Others feared that plague doctors could bring disease rather than cure it. Rumours abounded. Some whispered that plague doctors collected souls, not patients. Others believed they practiced forbidden arts, or that they were immune to the disease through secret knowledge or dark pacts. The fact that doctors rarely entered homes without full covering and often avoided speaking to the sick directly only deepened the fear and mystery surrounding them. Yet in times of desperation, communities still turned to them. A plague doctor's visit was feared, but their absence was worse. For all their strange attire and limited methods, they represented the only structured response to an otherwise invisible and terrifying threat. To receive a visit from a plague doctor meant you had not been entirely abandoned. Art and literature from later centuries would solidify the plague doctor's image as one of Gothic horror. The beak mask became a symbol of death and dread long after its use had ended. Even today, its image appears in festivals, horror fiction, and popular media, not as a figure of medical aid, but as a harbinger of fear. This duality of healer and omen reflected the era's blurred lines between science, superstition, and faith. In the eyes of the people, plague doctors walked a thin line between protection and prophecy, between medicine and magic. They were witnesses to catastrophe and symbols of a fragile human response in the face of forces they could neither fully see nor fully understand. Today, the image of the plague doctor has taken on a life of its own. It is instantly recognizable. The long, curved beak, black cloak, and vacant glass eyes. But this powerful symbol, so often associated with medieval times, is largely misunderstood and often inaccurately placed in history. Contrary to popular belief, the iconic plague doctor mask did not originate during the first great wave of the Black Death in the 14th century. The most recognizable form of the outfit, the beaked mask and waxed overcoat, was not widely used until the 17th century, particularly in Italy and France during later outbreaks. Earlier physicians treating the Black Death did not wear this kind of uniform at all. In fact, some worked without any protective gear whatsoever, which contributed to their high mortality rates. The plague doctor image we know today was further shaped not just by medicine, but by art and satire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, illustrators began to depict plague doctors in exaggerated fashion. Beaks longer than practical, eyes exaggerated for effect, and poses that emphasized their otherworldly presence. These drawings blurred the line between medical documentation and theatrical representation. In time, the image became divorced from its original context. By the 19th and 20th centuries, plague doctors were less associated with actual medical history and more with folk horror, masquerade costumes, and dark symbolism. The Venetian carnival adopted the beaked mask into its traditions, turning it into a figure of spectacle and performance. The haunting mask, stripped of its original function, became a character, part healer, part ghost. Today, the plague doctor appears everywhere, from video games and graphic novels to Halloween costumes and historical dramas. Its popularity stems not just from its strangeness, but from what it represents: a time of fear, confusion, and the human instinct to protect against the unknown. Yet behind the mask lies a real story, one of early attempts at disease control, of lives lost in service, and of the fragile bridge between medieval superstition and modern science. The legacy of the plague doctor is not just in what they wore, but in what they faced: a world without answers, and the courage to enter it anyway. Beneath the eerie mask and historical misconceptions, the plague doctor remains a symbol of something far more enduring than fear: human resilience. In an age when science was limited and answers were scarce, these individuals stepped into the heart of the world's deadliest outbreaks, not with certainty, but with purpose. Their tools may have been flawed and their understanding incomplete, but their presence marked a conscious choice to confront danger in service of others. Plague doctors, whether trained physicians or volunteers, often worked in isolation. They entered infected homes, walked streets emptied by death, and documented the toll of epidemics in a time before modern medical infrastructure. They recorded the names of the dead, observed symptoms, and in some cases even conducted early forms of epidemiological study, noting patterns of transmission and rates of mortality. Though they could not stop the disease, they laid the groundwork for future public health practices. Their methods, quarantines, protective clothing, herbal fumigation, reflect a society beginning to grasp that disease could be contained, even if it could not yet be cured. In this way, the plague doctor was a bridge figure, one foot in the world of humours, saints, and superstition, and the other in the emerging realm of observation, data, and structured response. Their uniform, so strange to modern eyes, was the result of a logical system built with the tools and beliefs available at the time. Rather than symbols of ignorance, the beaked masks and waxed cloaks were expressions of adaptation, early, imperfect prototypes of the personal protective equipment that would become essential centuries later. Perhaps this is why the image endures. The plague doctor reminds us not only of the horror of pandemics, but of humanity's refusal to surrender to them. Even in an age overwhelmed by death and mystery, people showed up. They experimented, documented, endured, and tried, despite the risks, despite the odds. Isabella of France entered the world in the year 1295, born into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. She was the daughter of Philip IV, King of France, and Queen Joan of Navarre. Her father was a monarch known for his cold efficiency and strict control over his realm, earning the nickname Philip the Fair, not for kindness, but for his pale complexion and stern, symmetrical features. Isabella's childhood was shaped by courtly formality, dynastic expectation, and the subtle warfare of diplomacy. Raised at the Capetian court, Isabella received an education befitting a royal daughter. She was trained not only in languages, piety, and etiquette, but also in statecraft. She learned early that her life would not be her own. It would be a tool of alliance, a piece on a much larger political chessboard. That opportunity arrived early. By the time she was 12 years old, Isabella was betrothed to Edward II of England, heir to the Plantagenet throne. This union was no romantic pairing. It was a strategic move to calm tensions between France and England after years of territorial disputes and rival claims. The marriage, sealed in 1302, was meant to secure peace. Instead, it would eventually ignite one of the most dramatic chapters in English royal history. Isabella left France and crossed the Channel to marry Edward in 1308. Though still a young girl, she entered the English court with poise and dignity, but she quickly found herself in a hostile environment. Edward II was not the ruler her father had expected. He was politically inexperienced, emotionally distant, and completely devoted to his male favourite, Piers Gaveston. Isabella, though young, recognised immediately that she had been set aside. In the early years of her marriage, Isabella played the dutiful queen. She bore children, including the future Edward III, and performed her ceremonial duties. But beneath the surface she was watching, learning, and waiting. Her intelligence, political instinct, and loyalty to her French lineage would one day drive her to challenge the English throne itself. Isabella's story was not one of quiet obedience. From the beginning it was clear. This was a queen born not to be ruled, but to rule. In the early years of Isabella's queenship, her position was more symbolic than influential. Despite her royal blood and her marriage to the King of England, Isabella was largely marginalised at court. Her husband, Edward II, was openly infatuated with his favourite, Piers Gaveston, a charismatic and ambitious nobleman. Their relationship, though never formally defined, was clearly more than political. Edward lavished titles and gifts upon Gaveston, at times at the expense of Isabella herself. This public favouritism humiliated Isabella. Gaveston was granted precedence over the Queen at official events, and her own household expenses were sometimes neglected while her husband funded his companion's indulgences. To many in the English nobility, this behaviour was not only offensive, it was dangerous. They viewed Gaveston as a corrupting influence on the king, and Isabella's growing isolation as a potential liability. Yet Isabella did not act rashly. She observed. She waited. Though still a teenager, she understood court politics and the value of patience. Her royal lineage gave her quiet influence. Her father, Philip IV, remained a powerful presence across the Channel. When English nobles finally forced Edward to exile Gaveston in 1308, it was partly through appeals to Isabella's injured dignity. But Edward soon brought Gaveston back, igniting further conflict. The tension reached its peak in 1312, when a group of nobles captured and executed Gaveston without royal approval. Though Edward mourned his friend, Isabella's status began to improve. The court had learned that unchecked royal favouritism could fracture the realm, and Isabella emerged from the crisis as a more central figure. Over the next decade, however, Edward repeated his mistakes. After Gaveston's death, he turned to new favourites, the Despencer family, particularly Hugh Despencer the Younger. The cycle of favouritism, resentment, and political instability resumed. Isabella, once again pushed aside, watched the realm spiral into conflict. But this time, she would not remain silent. Isabella had learned from the court's betrayals and her husband's weaknesses. She was no longer the quiet girl from France. She was a mother, a queen, and a strategist. And she was beginning to understand the full extent of her influence, not just in England, but across Europe. What began as exclusion was about to become revolution. By the year 1325, Isabella's marriage had become a battleground. Her relationship with Edward II had long deteriorated, and his continued devotion to Hugh Despencer the Younger had pushed the kingdom to the brink of rebellion. The Despensers were not merely royal favourites, they were power brokers, enriching themselves while punishing the king's enemies. Nobles were disinherited, executions were carried out, and entire families lived in fear of Despencer vengeance. Isabella, like many, had been stripped of her lands and influence. In a decisive moment, Isabella left England for France under the pretense of a diplomatic mission. Her brother, Charles IV, now sat on the French throne after the deaths of their older siblings. Charles had his own quarrels with Edward over territory in Gascony, and Isabella was tasked with smoothing relations. But once she arrived, she refused to return. What had begun as a royal errand transformed into self-exile. and a calculated move toward resistance. Isabella took a bold and unprecedented step. She refused to return to England while Hugh Despenser remained in power. She claimed that she feared for her life, citing the tyranny of the Despensers and her husband's indifference. Her refusal was a scandal, but it was also a masterstroke. For the first time, a queen consort was openly opposing a reigning king, and gaining allies as she did so. While in France, Isabella struck up a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer, an English noble who had fled Edward's wrath. Their connection was initially political, but soon became personal. Whether their romantic relationship had already begun is unclear, but by the time they joined forces, their interests were inseparable. Together, they began gathering support from disaffected English nobles and French allies. Isabella also had another ace, her son, Edward of Windsor, the heir to the English throne. She insisted he join her in France, away from his father's influence. The boy's presence gave her legitimacy. She was not simply a disgruntled queen. She was the mother of the future king, acting to protect the crown from tyranny. From exile, Isabella began to build a revolution. She was no longer just resisting Despenser. She was preparing to remove a king. By the autumn of 1326, Isabella of France had transformed from an exiled queen into a political force, preparing to overthrow the King of England. With Roger Mortimer at her side, she secured financial backing, troops from sympathetic French nobles, and promises of support from disaffected English lords. At the centre of their cause stood young Edward of Windsor, her son, and the rightful heir to the throne. His presence gave the entire campaign a veneer of legitimacy. It was a mother restoring the crown to its proper future, not simply a queen taking revenge. In 1327, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion, landing on the Suffolk coast with only a modest army. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in momentum. As they advanced, they encountered little resistance. The English people, weary of Despenser tyranny and royal mismanagement, welcomed them. Nobles and knights defected in droves. The political tides had shifted, and Isabella's gamble had paid off. Edward II, abandoned by many of his supporters, fled westward with Hugh Despenser. But their retreat was short-lived. They were captured by forces loyal to Isabella near Neath in Wales. The king was imprisoned, and Hugh Despenser the Younger was put on trial for treason. His execution was swift and brutal, intended to signal the end of a corrupt era. With the Despensers removed and Edward under guard, Isabella faced a difficult question: what to do with a living king? Though deposition was rare, it was not without precedent. In January of 1327, Edward II was formally forced to abdicate in favour of his son, now Edward III, a boy of just 14. The coronation was carried out with dignity, but it was clear who held the real power. Isabella ruled as regent alongside Mortimer, governing England in the young king's name. It was an extraordinary turn. A woman who had once been sidelined and humiliated now held the reins of an entire kingdom. But victory brought its own dangers. Power, once seized, must be maintained. And while Isabella had overthrown one king, she now found herself facing the expectations and scrutiny of an entire realm. Following the abdication of Edward II, Isabella of France emerged as the most powerful political figure in England. Although her son, Edward III, had been crowned king, he was still a boy. Isabella ruled as regent, sharing authority with her close ally and companion, Roger Mortimer. Together, they exercised royal power with a level of control that rivaled monarchs in all but title. Initially, Isabella's regency was well received. The removal of the Despensers brought relief to the nobility and commoners alike, and the promise of stability under her leadership offered hope. She enacted reforms, reversed unlawful seizures of land, and restored titles to those who had been disinherited under Edward II's rule. Her early decisions appeared measured and just, earning her considerable goodwill. But as time went on, criticism began to surface. Mortimer, now made Earl of March, amassed significant wealth and influence. He took over royal castles, received lavish grants of land, and behaved increasingly like a king in all but name. Many began to see in Mortimer the very same unchecked favouritism that had plagued Edward II's reign. Isabella, once seen as a symbol of justice, was now accused of indulgence and excess. She retained many of the lands and riches confiscated from former allies of her husband. Lavish expenditures and generous gifts to French relatives stoked resentment, especially during a time when the kingdom was still recovering from war and political unrest. Compounding the tension was the awkward presence of the deposed king. Though Edward II had abdicated, rumours circulated that he remained alive in captivity. This shadow over Isabella's rule raised suspicions and whispers of conspiracy. Her legitimacy, once rooted in justice, now rested on the fragile edge of public perception. To make matters more complex, Edward III was growing older and watching carefully. The boy king, now nearing adulthood, began to recognise the extent of Mortimer's power and his own mother's reliance on her companion. What had once been a regency was beginning to look like a regime. Isabella had claimed victory, but holding power would prove more perilous than seizing it. The queen who had toppled a king would soon face the challenge of reigning without becoming the very thing she had once destroyed. By the year 1330, Edward III was 17 years old, no longer a boy, and no longer content to watch his kingdom ruled in his name. Though he had been crowned king 3 years earlier, real authority remained firmly in the hands of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who continued to rule England with increasing boldness. Mortimer had grown arrogant, adopting the privileges of kingship without its title, and Isabella supported him unwaveringly. But both failed to recognise how quickly the tide was turning. The nobility, once grateful for the removal of the dispensers, now viewed Mortimer with suspicion and disdain. His accumulation of wealth and land, his harsh treatment of political rivals, and his central role in foreign and domestic policy made him many enemies. Behind the scenes, young Edward began to gather support from those who wished to see Mortimer's influence ended, and the king assume full power at last. The turning point came in the autumn of 1330, when Edward launched a secret coup. While staying at Nottingham Castle, he used a hidden passage to sneak a small group of trusted allies into the fortress. Under the cover of night, they arrested Mortimer without bloodshed. The operation was swift, discreet, and decisive. Isabella was taken into custody the following morning. Though she was treated with respect and spared public humiliation, her authority was immediately revoked. Mortimer, on the other hand, was tried for treason. Accused of abusing power, enriching himself unlawfully, and manipulating the crown, he was found guilty. Despite Isabella's desperate pleas, Edward ordered his execution. Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn in November of 1330. With Mortimer's fall, Edward III finally claimed the throne in full. He distanced himself from the excesses of the Regency, restored confiscated lands, and reassured the nobility that England was once again under rightful royal rule. As for Isabella, her fate was more complicated. Though she had helped depose a king and orchestrate a regency, Edward chose mercy over punishment. He did not imprison or exile her publicly. Instead, he allowed his mother to retire, away from court, away from politics, and far from the centre of power she once commanded. The she-wolf had been silenced, but not destroyed. After the dramatic fall of Roger Mortimer and the full ascension of Edward III, Isabella of France was no longer a queen in power, but she was still the king's mother, a position that granted her a measure of protection. Rather than subject her to imprisonment or public disgrace, Edward allowed Isabella to retire from public life in relative comfort. It was not punishment in the traditional sense, but it was exile nonetheless, a quiet removal from the stage she once dominated. Isabella was settled at Castle Rising in Norfolk, a fortified manor house surrounded by vast estates. There she lived under a sort of gentle supervision. Though she retained a portion of her wealth and status, she no longer wielded political influence. The court moved on without her, and her name slowly faded from royal decrees and chronicles. The woman who had ruled England through ambition and force now lived surrounded by gardens, servants, and silence. Despite this retreat from power, Isabella was not entirely abandoned. She received regular visits from family, including her son, Edward, who ensured she lived in comfort. Records show she maintained a small court of her own and engaged in acts of charity, religious devotion, and patronage of the arts. Her reputation, however, remained controversial. Some viewed her as a queen betrayed by circumstance. Others saw her as a traitor who had overstepped the bounds of royal decorum. In truth, Isabella's retreat was both a loss and a reprieve. The political world she had once navigated with such precision had turned against her, and her removal may have spared her the fate that many others in similar positions had suffered. Unlike Mortimer, she lived. Unlike Edward II, she kept her dignity. Her silent exile allowed her to rewrite the final chapters of her life, not in rebellion, but in reflection. For over 2 decades, Isabella remained at Castle Rising. She outlived many of her enemies and saw her son grow into one of England's most powerful and respected monarchs. But she never returned to court, never again played a role in policy or statecraft. She had stepped into history with fury and brilliance. Now she waited for it to settle. Isabella of France's life was marked by dramatic turns: queen, exile, regent, revolutionary. Her nickname, the She-Wolf of France, captured the fierce reputation she earned for her unyielding will and political cunning. Yet her legacy is far more complex than a simple label suggests. Isabella was a woman ahead of her time, a royal who refused to accept marginalization and instead used her intelligence and connections to influence the fate of kingdoms. Her actions led to the deposition of her husband, Edward II, a rare and controversial move in medieval Europe. In doing so, she challenged traditional gender roles and reshaped the monarchy. Her regency demonstrated that a queen could wield power effectively, even in a male-dominated society. She managed alliances, negotiated with nobles, and navigated international politics with skill. Though her partnership with Roger Mortimer ultimately ended in downfall, Isabella's initial rule brought much-needed stability after years of turmoil. Despite this, history has often judged her harshly. Many chroniclers portrayed her as manipulative and ruthless, focusing on her personal relationships and ambitions rather than her political achievements. These portrayals reflect the biases of their time, which struggled to reconcile strong female leadership with medieval ideals of womanhood. Modern historians, however, have begun to reassess Isabella's role, recognizing her as a key player in the shifting landscape of 14th century Europe. Her story sheds light on the complexities of power, gender, and survival in a turbulent era. It also reveals the precarious balance a queen had to maintain between loyalty to family and political necessity. Beyond politics, Isabella's life was a tale of personal sacrifice. Her marriage, once a political alliance, became a source of betrayal and hardship. Her exile was a quiet end for a woman who once shook kingdoms, yet she endured. Isabella's legacy lives on not only in history books, but in cultural memory, as a symbol of resilience, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a world stacked against her. The she-wolf may have been feared and vilified, but she remains undeniably one of the most fascinating figures of medieval history. Isabella of France spent her final years away from the political turmoil that had once defined her life. Living at Castle Rising in Norfolk, she devoted herself to religious contemplation, charity, and maintaining her household with dignity. Though her time as a queen and regent had ended, she remained a figure of significance, a royal mother, a former ruler, and a woman who had dared to challenge kings. Her relationship with her son, Edward III, remained respectful but distant. By the time of her death in 1358, Edward had firmly established himself as one of England's most formidable monarchs. He had restored the power of the crown, expanded English territories, and led the country into a new era. While Isabella had retreated from public life, her influence lingered in the very fabric of Edward's reign. Isabella's story is not merely one of scandal and rebellion, but also of survival and transformation. She navigated a treacherous world of shifting alliances, betrayal, and expectations placed on women of royal blood. Her ability to wield power, often in opposition to the men around her, left an indelible mark on English and French history. Her nickname, the She-Wolf of France, while initially